while they're all heading up, both the chairman and the executive director mentioned our partners from 35 countries. We sometimes hyperbolically say from every corner of the earth. They're true, 35 partners from Central Asia, Caucasus, Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia or the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. Truly, from Canada all the way down to Argentina, going through Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, everywhere. So welcome to Washington. And yesterday was just an amazing, amazing event. You're all mic'd up, so let me please introduce our moderator for the first panel on good governance, better business. What a panel we have for you today. Ambassador Lisa Gable is a member of the Global Advisory Council of Displaced International and co-chair of the Women's Democracy Network. A former US ambassador, she is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author and distinguished fellow at the SMU's Hunt Institute for Engineering and Humanity. She chairs World in 2050, the Diplomatic Courier's think tank on global megatrends, and previously served as CEO of FAIR, where she raised $100 million to expand food allergy research infrastructure. Earlier in her career, she held senior roles at the White House, Defense Department, State Department, and Intel, and served as US Ambassador to the 2005 Aichi World Expo. She holds degrees from the University of Virginia and Georgetown University. Welcome, Ms. Lisa.
Great, thanks for having me, and it's wonderful to be with you all today on this horrible rainy day. So I want to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panel who are to my left. First, immediately to my left is Rick Johnston, who's the chair of the Executive Board, Business at OECD. He's also the managing director of International Government Affairs at Citibank and is responsible for the management of Citi's relationship with governments and political figures around the world, recognized as an expert in international trade and multinational corporate business. Also next to him, we have John Dickerman, who is the Vice President of the United States Affairs Business Council Canada. Based in Washington, John represents the Business Council with a focus on trade, investment, economic security, and cross-border issues. Prior to joining the council, he served as the head of North America to the largest trade association representing British business interests, and has a long history and storied career at global law firms in Washington, D.C., New York, as well as the United States District Court and the U.S. Department of Justice. Then we have, we moved people around, sorry about that. We have Teruko Wada, who's with Keidanren. She's the executive director. This is the Washington office and leads public affairs activities in strengthening U.S.-Japan economic relationships and raising the profile of Japanese business in the United States. She has extensive experience and knowledge in public policy and advocacy, both domestically and internationally, having served Keidanren in Tokyo and also working with multinational organizations like the G7, G20, WTO, OECD, BIAC, and others. And then finally, we have Neil Bradley, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer and Head of Strategic Advisory, he's responsible for the organization's overall advocacy efforts. In addition to managing policy development for the Chamber, he oversees its government affairs activities, political programs, and relationship with business organizations. Also a well-known figure in the Washington area, having served for 20 years at the House of Representatives, also serving as a Deputy Chief of Staff and looking at formulation of policy in the Leader's Office. So we're very lucky to have this distinguished panel with us today. And really, as to carry on with the conversations that were started by Greg and Andrew, what we know is that there are strategies to attracting investment. One of those is a predictable business environment. And one thing I think we could all agree on is right now, maybe the business environment is not as predictable as we would hope. And so as we look at issues around how do we manage our partners, how do we look at legal reforms, transparency, and institutional capacity building, the key is building economic resilience and also making sure that investors feel confident when they're making investment. And so what I'd love to do is ask each of our panelists, in this era of unpredictability, what do you see as the primary objectives of your organization as we move into the next 12 months, as we finish out this quarter and we're moving into 2026? So Rick, I'll let you speak to that.
Thanks, Ambassador. And I'd like to say I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, but I can't see anything with these lights. I'm assuming you're out there somewhere. Yeah, this is a massive topic, and I've noodled over what to say today for quite a while, because there's so many things we can talk about. I thought our prior two speakers really covered a huge landscape of the kinds of issues that all of us care about. But let me start with underscoring, I think, what you just said. I thought about it. You know, we're so obsessed, of course, rightly so, with climate change. But climate has really changed in terms of how to do business. And it's not just global warming anymore. It's an environment of fragmentation. It's an environment of government intervention. And when you get government intervention, as I'm sure SIPE would preach to all of us, you also end up with exceptional exceptions, arrangements. It's a kind of an environment right now for not just business here in the United States, but business globally, where transactionalism is overtaking a values-based approach to doing business. And I think that this is something that unfortunately is a trajectory that I don't see an end to this. Transactionalism being, of course, an important part of what we do in business, but on the other hand, it also can be an excuse. And unfortunately, I'm seeing transactionalism and sort of the means justifying the end as being far too much of almost a mantra amongst so many different businesses, but just generally in culture in general. So we are in a very different climate, and it's a climate that I know Transparency International, I just looked this up, is basically saying that there is at least a stagnant approach to trying to combat corruption in governments around the world. Indeed, Transparency found that the United States, as an example, has slipped in its standing of combating corruption. That's something that I think we in the corporate community really need to pay attention to. Because as we look to those examples of where do we find our moral compass, where do we find the compulsion to be honorable, to act with integrity, to be responsible as business, we're really sort of, I don't know if you want to call it, meandering around, trying to find a compass. My CEO at Citi years ago, in one of his presentations, I thought probably hit the nail on the head for all of us as individuals, but you know, as individuals, we then influence how governments make decisions, how companies make decisions. And his rule of thumb was, whenever I'm confronted with a dilemma, I ask myself, what would my mother say? And I think, you know, when you really have to deal with these kinds of challenges on a day-by-day basis, maybe that simple kind of reference point helps. But it also says something about how we're going to have to deal with these questions, this deteriorating climate. It's a whole of society effort. There's a top-down approach, of course, which we talk about a lot here at SIPE. But I think also there's a bottom-up approach. And one of the things that we in the corporate community, I think, need to really pay much more attention to and get much more engaged in is in this bottom-up side of it. Because when you look to where the societies are getting their moral direction, if you think about religion, perhaps, as one area, that's in decline in most societies today in terms of attendance and participation. When you look at the question of government's not going to necessarily teach you anything in terms of morality other than to prosecute you for being corrupt or violating the law. Okay, fine, that's an element in all of this. But I do think, too, we've got to talk about ourselves in a family context and an individual context, and where are the schools taking us? Very, very sort of fundamental parts of our societies that from the bottom-up side of this challenge I think we at corporations are going to have to now more and more pay attention to that. And ultimately, I know I come from a banking background, money is critical. So in my mind, and I'll stop by simply saying that the private sector and all the money that we have to play with, utilize, deploy. We talk a lot about infrastructure development. We talk a lot about a variety of very large projects. But to me, one of the fundamental challenges for companies today is to start to invest and prioritize this topic much more than it has been. As was noted, I'm chairman of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD. Anti-corruption is one of our topics, but I don't believe it's enough of a topic for us when we meet with the ambassadors of the OECD, when we meet with government leaders. We've got to elevate, as companies, we've got to elevate this topic. It's got to be more of a priority in today's world than it has been in the past. We can't take it for granted that governments are going to deal with this, or that the larger organizations like BIAC. We have a zero corruption forum that we're now sponsoring. We're doing reports on this. The International Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber, of course, U.S. Council for International Business. All these major international business organizations have topics of anti-corruption committees, things like that, but they tend to be afterthoughts. And I think we are now in an era, in this transactional era that we're in, where we as companies have to devote, and our CEOs, who are considered by most of these polling now the trusted leaders in our societies, they have to start to emphasize this topic of fighting corruption and moral values, not fighting moral values, but adopting and living by moral values. Much more emphasis than it has been in the past.
So John, why don't you give us sort of your position as one in the Business Council. We have a unique relationship with our next door neighbor, Canada, but you also have a global reach. What are some of the issues that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, look, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a real privilege. It's certainly a privilege to be on this panel. I have a lot of notes here on strengthening the rule of law and transparency and regulation. But when thinking about our priorities and the priorities of the public sector, or the private sector rather, that we represent, I think the point that's most important is one of predictability. One thing that we prioritize more than anything for our businesses is predictability and kind of opportunity, and predictability in regulation, predictability in these areas of rules of law. Consistency is important, for sure. There's no question about that. But predictability more than anything for business when they're looking at investments means a lot. We're in DC. We think often in terms of election cycles. Businesses, as we all know in this room, don't think in terms of election cycles. They think in terms of decades, not in terms of 18 months or 2 years. So ensuring that there is predictability going forward for some of these investment decisions to be made, I think is the issue that's probably most important to us in the context of the discussion that we're having. And certainly one of the things that I'd like to point out is, we have some predictability opportunities already. We have some frameworks for predictability that exist. And Canada is a really good example of that. Canada, for the longest time, has prioritized open consultations, free trade agreements, and discussions in the private sector and in the public sector to ensure what's best for those types of investments. And one of the things that Canadian businesses is looking for is an opportunity for not necessarily a replication of that, because Canada isn't the perfect system. No country has the perfect system. But an opportunity for business to be engaged in the discussion around these agreements and around these regulations. I think what's very important for us is for the private sector and the public sector to come together and to acknowledge, at least from the public sector's side, that the private sector has expertise in these areas around regulatory transparency and what helps and elevates consistency and predictability for the business and investment environment. So for us, predictability, by far the most important thing at this moment.
Wonderful. And Wada-san, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I have a personal history in Nagoya, Japan, having lived there for 2 years, serving as U.S. ambassador to the Expo. So I understand the unique relationship that we have with our Japanese colleagues and the strong business presence that you have, as well as that of a free democratic system in an area that's confronting a push by the Chinese. What are your viewpoints right now on some of the big issues that we are facing?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gable. I would like to also thank SIPE for introducing me to this great discussion today, and it's a great privilege for me to be seated together with the distinguished panelists today on behalf of Keidanren and the broader Japanese business community. Let me first briefly introduce what Keidanren is. Many of you may not be familiar with the organization. Keidanren is a business association representing Japanese businesses, and we are headquartered in Tokyo. And our membership is as expansive as over 1,500 major companies who are doing business in Japan, including American companies, perhaps Canadian companies as well. I have to check, but many international companies who are doing business in Japan. So our function is to bridge between business and the government, both domestically, not just within Japan, but also internationally as well. We advocate for policies that support sustainable growth, open markets, and democratic values. And Keidanren is deeply engaged in global policy forums, including the G7 Business Summit, which business communities of G7 economies gather, and the OECD through BIAC, under the leadership of Mr. Johnston here. And also we engage with bilateral policy dialogue with business leaders throughout the globe, actually. Whenever the business leaders of certain countries come to Japan and wishing to have a dialogue with business leaders in Japan, Keidanren is a window of, we provide the forums for discussion with the business leaders and also the political leaders who visit Japan seeking for investment to their countries. And as executive director of Keidanren USA, I just recently moved to Washington, D.C., so I'm quite new to this environment. But I represent Japanese companies that have made extensive contributions to the United States economy. And you may be aware, but Japan has been the #1 investor in the United States for 6 consecutive years, and it continues to grow. But these companies are not just investors, but they are long-term partners in innovation, workforce development, and community building. Today, Japanese companies directly employ nearly 1 million Americans, and more than half of them are in manufacturing, making Japan the top 4 employer in US manufacturing for 16 consecutive years. This is a testament to the trust, stability, and shared values that underpin the US-Japan economic relationship. But this level of investment does not automatically come. It has to be earned. This reflects a choice by Japanese companies to invest in countries where the rule of law is strong, regulatory frameworks are transparent, and policy environments are predictable and stable. As Mr. Dickerman just emphasized, predictability and policy stability, they're both important and becoming more and more important for business planning these days. Investors need to understand not only the current regulatory landscape, but also how it may evolve. Sudden shifts in policy or its capricious enforcement, especially those driven by short-term political pressures, can undermine investor confidence and delay or cancel major projects. Predictability allows companies to allocate capital, develop talent, and build infrastructure with confidence. Regulatory transparency complements this by ensuring that rules are clear, accessible, and consistently enforced. For example, transparent licensing procedures, clear criteria for approval, and fair dispute resolution mechanism reduce uncertainty and lower transaction cost. According to the World Bank, countries that improve regulatory framework transparency and reduce political risks see measurable increase in foreign direct investment. And lastly, I just want to add one point. about the policy alignment among like-minded countries is essential. Whether it's standards or the regulations or the topic of economic securities, coordinated frameworks among these countries are critical to ensuring level playing field, that democratic values remain the foundation of global trade and investment. So for this purpose, we have high expectations for OECD and BIAC. So we, as Keidanren continues to commit to this positive policy dialogue with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Neil, down there at the end, you get to be the closing on our recapping of the most important issues you see that we are walking into for the last quarter of this year and 2026.
Yeah, and I think these issues are going to extend well beyond 2026. I think Rick is right. This is a bit of a new day. And I think one of the things that contrasts this new day with the old day is the fact that really for the last 35 years, since the end of the Cold War, we could walk into almost any room where a conversation like this was taking place and expect that there was broad agreement that rule of law, predictability in public policy making, predictability for business was a good thing and something to be striven for and attained. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. Rick described it as more of a transactional relationships, and I think that's certainly true. And I think it's incumbent on us to figure out how we move from the transactional back to the more rule of law process oriented. I think a part of that is really going back to first principles. Next year America will celebrate its 250th anniversary. Also happens to be the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And it's maybe worth thinking about why free markets and democracy go so well together. And from my perspective, I think it's because they both come from the same place. It's an inherent respect for the worth of each individual person. And as we form a society, we show our respect for the worth of the individual by respecting their wishes at the ballot box in the democratic process. We show our respect for their decisions in our economy by respecting their decisions in the marketplace, by allowing them to go to the market in the town square and create things and sell things and barter and trade as they desire. It turns out that both democracies and free economies both need similar infrastructure. They need the rule of law. That's why we have written constitutions and written laws. They need clear processes for how we do things. In a democracy, that means how we elect those for a period of time to lead our government. It also means clear processes when someone's accused of wrongdoing, of how we adjudicate that and how we go through a judicial system. For business, it means clear processes that give you predictability about what's permitted and what's not permitted, and how, when you need government approval for something, it's clear that you do and how you go about achieving that. And in many ways, we've kind of have an erosion of that kind of understanding that's led us to this place where more things are arbitrary, more things are uncertain, and that then leads to all the economic and societal downsides that so many of us talk about. And so whether it's going back to the first principles of the founding, or I liked Rick's suggestion, in some ways it's what our parents taught us. The ends don't justify the means. The how you do things matters, so process matters. And that's true whether we're talking about what we're doing as an individual, what we're doing as a company, or what we're doing as a society, a country, and a collection of nations. And so to me, I think the most important thing that we can do to get ourselves back on track is remind ourselves at what's at stake, not just from the standpoint of GDP and economic growth, but what's at stake in terms of core first principles.
Well, thank you for everyone. And what we talked about, if we sort of do a recap of key points that were brought forward, predictability, primary topic that each of you discussed. Secondarily is the importance of having business at the table, but a reminder to business that it's about relationships, long-term partnerships. It's not just a transactional, quarterly driven relationship. And then also looking at manufacturing integration. One of the things our countries have done that are represented here is the level of foreign direct investment in manufacturing in different countries in the supply chain. But I think one thing that struck me, and it was where my head was going also, is sort of the morality that we are struggling with, a moral code that we're struggling with. For a period of time, we operated off of a series of principles. In fact, after the end of the Cold War, we went out with the Constitution and had conversations with countries about how they might develop their own constitutional structures that met the needs of their economies, of their people, of their democracies. So if you look at post-war institutions, they're faltering. And it's no surprise. Some of them have been around for 75 years. And before 75 years ago, when we set them up, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the ability to fly everywhere. We weren't sending our employees out to everyone's countries all the time. So we had a heavy dependency on those diplomatic elements that did. But as you see the rise of China and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, how should business engage in these discussions? How should we relook at what has been the structure, and where can business play a greater role in that process of both diplomacy? There's always political rhetoric. We live in political cycles and news cycles, but where can you as businesses really maintain that steadiness that's going to drive the predictability that we all desperately need for our investors? So Rick, would you like to go?
Sure, I'll start with trying to sort of repeat what I think I said earlier, which is corporate leadership is now one of the most, and this is according to polling data, corporate leadership is looked to in not just our society, but globally. I should point out, BIAC, for example, represents over 11 million enterprises.
Wow.
And in that context, these corporate leaders are now viewed by society as these examples to follow. They set standards. And it does strike me that our corporate leadership has to become far more aware of their role that they're playing in our societies, and encouraging and talking more about the value systems that you've just mentioned. This is something that, as we're talking about here, the climate has changed. Mm-hmm. And it's no longer just profit motive. It's no longer just, making money for your, according to your charter of your corporation. You are societal leaders in corporations nowadays. And I think that all of us in the business community have to understand that our roles are taking on more than just the way it used to be, given this new climate.
Wada-san, we look at expos going on in Osaka right now, it's around cultural integration and relationships, but also very much around business, maintaining those relationships with a wide variety of countries, 100 some odd countries that are there. Japan has a very sort of structured, long-term trade and business development process. You represent that. And I think it is very uniquely Japanese because you do so much with the external world. How are you seeing how you would like to see these businesses come together as we have China rising, as we have Russia with Ukraine? Where are some of the places where you think we can be stronger together?
I think the stronger together is the exact word that I would use, because in this kind of difficult geopolitical situation, it is important that all the stakeholders who have the common interest should work together. And working alone is risky in this political environment also. And for that purpose, for example, Keidanren partner with other business organizations throughout the countries. Like we work with BCC, we work with CCC also, but we work with BCC, and we work with U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, or other USCIB. So we collaborate constantly on common issues that we are facing as challenge. And the perfect forum for those kind of discussions can be either B7 Summit or the BIAC, the Business at OECD, is also a perfect forum for that kind of collaboration so that business can work together and come up with constructive policy proposals to the governments of the members of the OECD, perhaps, and try to achieve policy goals that all the businesses have in common. And also, at the same time, I want to emphasize the dialogue between public and private is essential in shaping policies. And you mentioned that the post-war institutions, and one of them, the WTO, is an essential infrastructure for businesses to do business globally. And Keidanren particularly quite active engaging with this WTO reform. We invite Director General Okonjo to Keidanren, and we even preparing a kind of a high-level delegation visit to Geneva to engage in that policy dialogue with the WTO leadership. How the businesses, especially the Japanese businesses, can help the effort of WTO reform, for example, because we are not the users of the system, we are the stakeholder of the system, but we also want to be the proactive partner to help reform the current system we sincerely need.
And, Neil, as you look at the chamber, where do you see your unique ability on relationships? I think one advantage I have now is I'm a little bit older than I was when I showed up in Washington to work for Ronald Reagan, and I'm seeing third generations of relationships, right? It's something I'm very much seeing. All of a sudden, the sons and daughters of all these people are sort of following the same path. That's unique. That's different than when it used to be concentrated in the hands of wealthy families or heads of nations. And I think the chamber has a very interesting perspective on that, where it's a combination of relationships, but also an understanding that you gotta stay with the rules.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important things we do at the Chamber is convene, right? And it is bringing people together, whether that's political and business leaders domestically or political and business leaders globally. I think that's incredibly important, and maybe no more important than in this time, because I think in the process of convening and having those forums, it becomes really important that we articulate a few key things. The first is that these global institutions really do matter, and that there is no substitute for them. It's not to say that they don't need reform, as you mentioned, the reform of the WTO or the WHO or the International Postal Union, or you can go through the whole alphabet soup. They all serve a very distinct purpose, and there's no substitute for replacing those. And particularly as we're talking to our leaders here in the US, there's no substitute replacing them simply with US kind of imposed solutions. That these institutions work because we're bringing people together, we're vesting people in the solutions that are being created. I think the reason that's important, the second thing that we have to do when we convene these folks, is that to successfully counter China and to successfully counter this move towards unilateralism, transactionalism, fragmentation that would exist if these institutions break apart, we have to refute the idea that this is a zero-sum game, that for China to get ahead, somebody else must lose. For any one country to get ahead, someone else must lose, and that this is really an exercise of divvying up the fixed pie. It is not an exercise in divvying up the fixed pie, and if we become to think of it, it's only going to fuel the things that we're concerned about. If instead, through the institutions, these international institutions, it returns to the idea of how we grow the global pie for the benefit of all of us in our respective capabilities and our respective economies, then I think that's a thing that reinforces what made these institutions kind of great from the beginning. And so if we can, through the convening process, move beyond we've connected so-and-so to so-and-so and get back to now that so-and-so and so-and-so are connected, it's really time that we use our collective voice to those two ends. I think we can be quite successful.
You know, it's interesting you should say that. There's no substitute for replacing these basic functions, these functions of rules and standards that we set up in the post-war world that we're highly dependent upon. And John, not to put you on the spot, but we had a little difficulty with our relationship with our next door neighbor, Canada, at the beginning of last year, but we moved through that. And one of the things I saw is that we moved through it because of relationships. And I'd be curious how, as you were managing this difficult conversation, which we've seemed to have moved through, where did you tap into for those structural elements that enabled you to ignore the political conversation and sort of keep all of your partners moving forward?
Yeah, I think a really important question in the context of that challenge, and the way that we did that was to tap into the existing relationships that we had in the private sector, but also in the public sector, but it's clearly in the private sector. I think one of the things that is really important to remember from a private sector perspective is they're not just faceless institutions of investment, they're employers of women and men as well. And one of the very important things that we do as investors in the United States, our members do as investors in the United States and abroad, is import the values that are important in Canada to the regions that we invest in. And I think that that's something for years that the private sector has done. It was mentioned earlier that before the 24-hour news cycle and instant information that we get right now, diplomacy was so important when it came to the I think identification of what values a country had when they were coming into that country for diplomacy. But oftentimes, the private sector was also coming into that country and representing those values for good or for bad. So I think dipping into those relationships, ensuring that the folks in the environments that we were investing in understood how important the connection was between the United States and Canada was completely invaluable. And ensuring that we had connections at the local and subnational level was almost more important than the discussions we had in Washington, D.C. So really, I think kind of having those relationships and I wouldn't say exploiting them, but valuing them is something that was really important.
And you had some great commercials during that time period, too. I'm just going to tell you, your creative marketing people really helped bring home that reminder of the connected relationship we had with our friends.
Ambassador, can I add one last point? And it's sort of dawning on me as I'm listening to our commentary that this goes to Andrew's point about hand-wringing, but I think it's something we, again, in the business community have got to recognize and deal with it. And that is, here and abroad, there is this huge perception of the elite and the privileged not having to really abide by the rules, and all the rest of us have to suffer through it. And until we can break that down and somehow demonstrate that we in the business community, like you just said, we're the employers, we pay the taxes, we're the real economy, for God's sake. We've got to demonstrate that we are not the privileged, we are not the elite, and that the elite and the privileged are not necessarily above and beyond the law. And until we can start to grapple with that, and this is a growing problem. This is not something, of course, that just popped up last week, but it is growing. And until we can, in the business community, start to recognize that too as a really significant topic for us to address, I think we're going to lose this battle.
I absolutely agree, because the thing I took away from what John said was we are not just investors, we're employers of women and men. And I always think about Margaret Thatcher, other people's money. Until we recognize that we're stewards of other people's money, we're here for a period of time with the responsibility to steward their money. It's not our money, it's their money. And this is interesting because it leads to one of the points that I know the group really wanted to lean into, which is we've got a lot going on right now where it is challenging these structures, which is you've got the AI revolution, you have Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? To some degree, it's control of your money. That is how many of the libertarians who are big proponents of Bitcoin would talk about it. It's non-governmental control of money. It's my money. I'm keeping my money. AI is going to create even greater challenges. But we also have a rise in protectionist policies. So each of you, what are some of the things that you're putting forward, you've just articulated that, but some of the others of you, is there something that you just keep reminding people of? I think that's part of it, is we have these institutions, we have these frameworks. What do you want those young people who are struggling to remember? Neil, what are your thoughts?
I think, well, let's start with the vantage point that business has. In a world in which decline in all institutions, church, state, the individual organs of the state here, our judiciary, our executive, our Congress, are all falling. Business, and particularly small business, remain trusted. We've fallen a little bit too, by the way, but we're still more trusted than kind of all of these other institutions. That gives us both an opportunity and a responsibility about what the private sector can deliver, what the private sector has delivered in terms of prosperity and opportunity. I think in some ways we've allowed the debate to move away from the reality that we're almost too quick to apologize for the failings of our free market system and too slow to talk about what it's done to lift people economically. We're too quick to talk about the ills of globalization, not quick enough to talk about what we've done to lift billions of people out of wrenching poverty. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we're all focused on the things that are wrong, that people, particularly those younger generations, never were educated about the things that are right. I think this extends to our politics and how we engage in things too. One of the worst things in the political sector is watching, let's just take the Congress for example, elected officials here lament that Congress isn't trusted, that no one respects the institution, as they promptly run to a microphone to denounce their colleagues, talk about how corrupt they are, and how they don't care about America the way that they do. Well, no wonder people think that there's no trust in the institution when we've told them they shouldn't have trust in it. And so this is not to negate the need for reform. This is not to negate the need to improve the system, to address issues of affordability, to address issues of economic mobility. We always have a need to do that. But to the extent that we're only focused on what we've gotten wrong, we shouldn't be surprised when people say, well, I guess this little system that you've created for us really isn't all that good, since it turns out we can't fix any of these problems. Maybe we should opt for a different system.
Yeah. Wada-san, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. It's just this kind of discussion kind of reminded me of the positioning of Keidanren in Japanese internet society, actually. Keidanren is like symbol of big bad business. And whenever anything happens bad in the Japanese society, they accuse big business, and Keidanren can be the target of the kind of discussion in the internet. But I think it's that we need to explain ourselves. The Keidanren needs to explain ourselves what kind of system we have, what kind of governance system we have, and that each corporation have responsibilities as a great corporate citizen, and they're doing so much good in the society, but they don't know of it. So there's a part of a responsibility on Japanese business side because they tend to be quite quiet about what they're doing for the betterment of the society. And we need to sometimes make sure that people understand what kind of contributions Japanese businesses are making through paying taxes, bringing employment, and contributing to the, like for example, the infrastructure they're enjoying. Mm-hmm. They're maintained by businesses. You can enjoy the convenient lives because those infrastructures are maintained steadily by the employees of the companies who are steadily working toward to make sure the system runs smoothly. So we have to be accountable to the society, the shareholders, the stakeholders, but also for the future generation, next generations. sometimes people tend to forget how the system works, and we need to keep reminding that we are here to be responsible for paying the part of as a business. Delivering those kind of services requires a certain responsibility, and the businesses are sincerely doing that.
And John, what about you? You've had the opportunity, and I know you're not representing the British businesses yet, but you've got two countries that have had a lot of interesting conversations on some of those points. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so my first point on this panel was about predictability. And I think it rings slightly true here as well, although I think I would couch it in a different term in the context of this question. Living up to our commitments is incredibly important. One of the big challenges that existed between Canada and the US was the fact that Canada wasn't living up to their commitment when it came to defense funding and NATO funding. And that was something that was a bipartisan issue here in Washington, D.C. in the US. It wasn't something that came from one administration or the other. And if you look at the public in Canada, the Canadian public was wholeheartedly in favor of Canada living up to their commitments that they had made under the NATO treaty to fund defense in the way in which that they said they would. So living up to that commitment was incredibly important to the general public. But living up to your commitments in business is incredibly important as well. Doing that so you can ensure that the public that you're investing in and you're employing believes that you are going to be a valued partner is essential. But having partnership within government to be able to live up to those commitments is equally important. The red tape that business has to deal with, muddiness or opaque transparency and regulations, makes it incredibly difficult for business who want to invest hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in our communities to live up to those commitments that they want to make. And the private sector being able to live up to those commitments is what will build prosperity in our communities. So I think living up to commitments is incredibly important in the context of what we're talking about. Sure, regulatory transparency. So if a business wants to invest billions of dollars in a pipeline, they can actually do that is essential. And that just isn't specific to our individual countries. That goes to the bilateral and multilateral agreements that we have as well. We need to be sure that we have the capacity to live up to those commitments because those agreements are going to be respected and they're going to be transparent.
What each of you have talked about is the rule of law does provide better returns. We got that, right? You have commitments, you can keep those commitments, you have predictability with those commitments. So then that leads to the question of which, how much rule of law is enough and when do we go too far? And we are talking about individuals who are, again, you have a heavy libertarian population that's growing around the world. You have an extremely large populism, sort of motivation and conversation going on. People can see stuff, right? They can see it. And so, and they want to run. They want to run and they want to, they want to go as fast as they can. And we see it from the street vendor in Istanbul or, Costa Rica to the big multinationals. So what's enough?
Well, it's, from a business perspective, of course, I would say it's safe to say we all feel we're a bit over-regulated. But I think that a case in point to what you're asking, the OECD just did a review of their multinational enterprise guidelines. And at BIAC, we weighed in heavily with the OECD because that's our job, that's the mission, to suggest that perhaps it was a bit of overreach, a little bit too much reporting, so on and so forth. And I think the answer to your question ultimately is, and it's an overused phrase, but really making the public-private partnership a partnership, not sort of a one-way dialogue, or not here are the rules, we'll let you comment, but we really don't care what you have to say. Right. So I do think that perhaps an approach that would help modulate this overreach, and it's certainly government is, like you ask people at the European Commission, what's your raison d'etre, and it's to regulate. And I think the Europeans, unfortunately, are coming to the conclusion that's maybe not always the best approach. but I think it needs more of an emphasis on really trusting the private sector to tell you and government and the regulators, just how far you really can go before it becomes untenable, unreasonable, and frankly, not implementable.
Right. Yeah.
I think we have to be careful not to confuse rule of law with abundance of law and regulations. Those are two very different things. And so, by the way, it also tends to be that when you have an overabundance of law and regulations, it becomes very easy to find yourself in the normal course of the day violating one of those regulations or violating the law. And then it becomes really hard to maintain a rule of law because the more that we have, the quicker all of us become criminals because everyone's going to do something in the course of the day that violates some regulation promulgated however many decades ago. So having separated those, I think in addition to the private sector having kind of a seat at the table, I think in free markets, we ought to emphasize how, and not just the process of regulating, meaning private sector at the table, but the process of how regulations function themselves. So one way of regulating is to say, I would like you to do X this particular way. And so I'm going to manage how your business makes loans. I'm going to manage how your business provides benefits to your employees. I'm going to manage the content of what you as a manufacturer produce. The other way of doing regulations is to say, here's the goal or the thing that we want to achieve and protect, and we're going to allow the freedom of private sector innovation to figure out the best way to get there. And if you take the example of the United States, we had in the 70s and 80s awful industrial-induced acid rain, very destructive to the environment. And it would have been very easy for the US to say, well, we're just going to ban X, we're going to ban Y, we're going to tell you. We actually didn't take that approach. We said, we want to limit emissions. You figure out how to do it and meet these goals. And it turned out that was quite successful, and we managed to reduce emissions, clean up our air, and we did it without harming growth. And so that's a difference once you get to the regulatory structure, I think in free markets, that we want to prioritize how those regulations function.
Wada san you.
Thank you. I need to jump in because deregulation or regulatory reform is one of my favorite topics. So Keidanren has been a strong advocate for regulatory reform for many years because that's primarily what we do representing Japanese businesses in collaborating or asking the government to change their laws and regulations. So we started our advocacy effort by saying we should deregulate. But the government people, of course, didn't like that concept. Of course, they naturally want to regulate. So we changed the term to regulatory reform rather than deregulations. And each regulation should have some objective they want to achieve through that policy or regulations. So that's where the businesses should step in to have a dialogue with the government to make sure those regulations are more reasonable and feasible on the ground and enforceable on the ground. So we constantly engage with the government and give our feedback to the government, and the government come to us asking whether this regulation is working or is there anything that we can change. So that kind of very positive, constructive dialogue benefits both government and the business. So it is important to have this kind of relationship. The partnership between the government and private is essential. Thank you.
John?
I think dialogue is key. There's no question in my mind. Dialogue between the public and private sector is so important in this discussion. Canada for a long time has been an environment where there's institutionalized dialogue and the development of regulations. Advisory councils and investment roundtables have been incredibly important. In practice, do those things work perfectly all the time? Of course they don't, because we don't build perfect institutions. But one of the things that I think is incredibly important for government to remember in the context of building these regulations is, when you're talking about regulating the private sector, you're making regulations for us, but they're laws that are built to help us succeed, not laws that need to be built to help us fail. And if you think about that in the context of a trade agreement specifically, I mean, who is a trade agreement for? It's not for one government to another government. It's for the businesses of one country to invest in the people and businesses of another country. So if you can't bring business and the private sector into the dialogue around how to structure those trade agreements, or if you can't do so in a way that's consistent and transparent and clear, then I think you're creating an environment where business will look elsewhere, where that consistency, transparency, and clarity does exist. So that dialogue to me is I think, the most important point that all of my colleagues on this panel made so much more eloquently than I did.
And Neil, I'll let you do the wrap-up comment there.
Yeah, just to take this one step further, I do think it's absolutely critical that we're at table. But when the business community is at table, we have to resist the temptation to use the power of the state to lock in rules that protect how we do things, or our business or our industry, or how our particular company does it. And we see that temptation a lot, because the table is never going to be so big that you capture the entrepreneur, the innovator, who's going to disrupt the entire sector. And so, regulatory capture of the private sector is a real thing. And I think we have a responsibility as advocates of free markets to warn against the business community not just succumbing to regulatory capture, but becoming an advocate of regulatory capture, because it works for this quarter or this year. And so that is an important thing I don't think we can lose sight of.
Well, I appreciate so much this panel. We've really covered a wide variety of issues, from morality to rule of law to all of the underlying elements that create that concept of predictability. And I think what you all have done an amazing job is provided more of a richness to the predictable nature that people are looking for. And one thing, just going back to it, which I just loved, is we're not just investors, it's employers of men and women. And it's not just investors, it's fulfilling the individual dreams of men and women. And I think that the leaders here on this stage get that concept, and I so appreciate your being people who are part of this unpredictable time that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have, before you all get up, we actually have a Q&A opportunity here, which I just realized. Sorry about that. So it was a good wrap-up with what we've said, and we're not taking any pictures quite yet. Do we have questions from the floor?
Can you see the floor?
Can you see the floor? Any questions from the floor? You got a long time to answer questions. No questions out there?
Really?
Please, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for a great discussion. My name is Manuel Glave. I am a Peruvian economist working at a think tank, a group for the analysis of development. I have a couple of questions, comments. First one regarding compliance. As you know, the private sector has been under scrutiny in terms of how to engage and to embed civil society in the compliance certification. For example, in extractive industries, the narrative of the self-regulation or the self-control by the private sector is highly criticized by civil society organizations. So in the challenge of building trust and the challenge of building predictability, how the private sector tackles the challenge of how to certify and how to generate trust in the compliance narrative within the sector and engaging with the civil society. That is one question, and if we have more time, I can add another one.
It's a great question. Rick, you want to go ahead?
I'll give you one anecdote about Citi, for example. Obviously, banking sector is very, very heavily regulated. But in my time with Citi, which is now, I don't know, I've lost count, it's something like 17 years. But our compliance group has tripled in size in the last 15 years. And it's sort of apropos to the point earlier about regulation. How far does regulation go before it really starts to be counterproductive? And I would say that given the fact we're spending so much more money on compliance, and I mean, I'm sitting there so many times having to take training now in order to ensure that we are in compliance with all the rules and the regulations that obviously are imposed upon us, that I think it's a demonstration of, yes, the corporate responsibility to comply, but much to my point earlier about when the OECD was drafting its multinational enterprise guidelines updates, we at BIAC at least felt that there was a bit of overreach, that it was going to make compliance incredibly difficult for particularly small and medium-sized firms, and that when you do that, much to Neil's point, you sort of get to the point where you can't comply. It's just not in your, it's not possible. It's not that you have malintent or anything. You just can't comply. And that creates an environment of, well, they're not in compliance, so why do I have to comply? And then it turns into a dangerous, vicious circle.
Wada Santi and Neil?
Sorry. Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, were you going to?
No, please.
Particularly when we have kind of self-compliance, internal compliance, I think it's really important that those systems have a mechanism for when you identify something that has gone wrong, that you can bring that forward and show what you're doing about it without fear of being punished for identifying the thing that went wrong and bringing it forward to say that what you're doing about it. Because listen, mistakes are going to happen. They're human nature. They're bad apples in this world, and the strength of a kind of a compliance system really isn't in the did we achieve 100% universal compliance. It's did we have a mechanism to self-correct when things were out of compliance. And so I think that's a part that the state has to do. I think the part that the business community has to do is when someone realizes that they're not in compliance and tries to bury it under the rug or get away with it, we should have zero tolerance for that. Because if we don't have zero tolerance for that, then no one's going to establish the civil society trust that you mentioned that you talked about, and that I agree is so necessary.
Wada-san?
Thank you. I quite agree that compliance is essential, but in order to make sure that compliance is working and it is always there, that's why we need a sound corporate governance system, not just a structure of it, but we need to make sure that system works within that governance system. So not having the right people and have a right communication channel to secure the safe kind of line that you can kind of ring a bell when something goes wrong. And also the disclosure is also important to make sure that everything is happening is kind of clearly seen by the stakeholders. Of course, too much disclosure is always a troublesome, and I'm not asking for more disclosures, but the appropriate amount of disclosure may be necessary to gain the trust from the public.
John?
I think the only other point that I would make is just be careful with how institutionalized compliance gets, right? I mean, make sure that it's not top-heavy and that you have regional expertise. And if the regional expertise doesn't exist in the areas that you're working in, invest in building that regional expertise. So investment on the business side is I think, as important as a partnership with government on that.
And it seemed as if we were hearing about blockchain a lot as a mechanism for ensuring compliance, or at least being able to track, especially how we treat different points and times of the distribution process into the manufacturing. But we're not hearing about it as much anymore. Does anybody have any inputs on where did it fulfill the grand plans that we had for blockchain, or are we still working on that?
Still working on it. But I mean, for us, for example, in the banking sector, artificial intelligence, the ledger system, blockchain, all of that, we're still adopting, and I can tell you, for me, for example, I am told that my compensation is based on how much I start to use artificial intelligence in my work.
Mm-hmm.
So there's much more emphasis on all the digital tools that are becoming available, but are also still evolving. And I think we're all going to be confronted with this for several years to come in terms of being adaptable, but also, I think, somewhat responsible and not completely captured and becoming victims to all the demands that are going to be made for us to learn new ways by which to work in a digital economy.
John, you were shaking your head. Thoughts?
Oh, no, it's just there's not a finite amount of work, right? So, I think AI is not going to make us any less busy. It's just going to make us more productive, and being able to use that in a way that is consistent with our values is incredibly important.
What about the tracking process, Wada-san, in the manufacturing process? Because
Especially
that's where some of these hiccups happen in other
True.
countries.
Especially sometimes the government asks the private businesses to prove where this item came from,
Right.
where they're sourced. But because the supply chain is so long and complicated, it is sometimes almost impossible for the manufacturers of the final products to track down all the way to the origin of the material or the parts. So there should be a line, of course we want to be responsible for what we are supplying, but you know who you're buying from. Mm-hmm. But we don't know who this person is buying from, because sometimes this supplier wants to keep it secret because they could be kind of bypassed if they know the original supplier of the product is. So it's part of their business secret, so they want to keep it secret. So they want to keep it on their own. So keeping track of the items or the materials all the way down to the origin of it, it's almost impossible. So maybe with some very strong regulatory power, maybe you can ask each supplier to tell me did you buy this from? And then you go to the next seller and then ask, who did you buy this from? But it's too costly, and I'm pragmatic from the business point of view. Of course, if there's any digital solutions for this, that will be welcomed, but still, currently we are tackling this problem quite seriously. It's a serious burden on businesses.
Neil?
I agree with everything that's been said. Sometimes we get enamored by technology, particularly blockchain. Well, we could track everything all the way down. Sure, that has a cost, and we owe it to do a little cost-benefit analysis. Is the benefit that we're getting from whatever it is problem that we're going to try to solve, is it worth the cost of implementing that? And I'm not sure it always is.
Do you have any other questions? Yes. This gentleman right here. There we go.
Good morning. Thank you for work here. Yeah. Thank you for a great discussion. Askar Sadiko from Kyrgyz Republic. I was wondering how you would comment the recent moves, the new administration moves to, a bit of lower down the role of ESG practices in business, and with this posing the action of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. How do you see the role of ESG in, good governance and FCPA in the future? And is it still about good governance, better business, or it's just about, profit governance, better business? And with the increase of right-wing movements across the world, do you see any threats posed to the ESG practices and good governance practices among businesses? Thank you.
Neil?
Sure. So let me take each of those in turn. On foreign corrupt practices, this is another example of where I worry we may have confused the need for reform. I think from our perspective, there's need for reform of FCPA with the message that was sent when we said, we're just not going to enforce it, right? And so what we, in my opinion, we should be doing is having a discussion about how we have a stronger, more workable Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, not injecting these kind of questions about essentially whether we're going to have one or not. So it's one of those things where it's not that there wasn't a problem, but we have to get the right solution to address that problem. With respect to ESG, I think the biggest issue is that it's a term that both has a million meanings and no meaning whatsoever. And so people have been able to impose onto ESG whatever it is that they like or whatever it is that they fear. And that certainly is what's happened in our domestic politics here with respect to ESG. I would suggest that the right way to look at ESG is that ESG has always mattered and will always matter to the extent that you define ESG as things that are material to the operations of a business. And so governance is almost always material to the operations of a business for the reasons that we mentioned. That's why you don't hear a lot of criticism about the G in ESG. The environmental and the societal can often vary from business to business. So if you're in the, if you make soda or bottled water, environmental factors about accessibility to clean water and manufacture, like that is really material to your operations. If if you're selling insurance, maybe it's a lot less material. And so I think we have to kind of get back to understanding that the source of what should matter in ESG is the source of what's material in terms of impact to the operations of any given business.
Wada-san, or do you have
Yes. About the foreign corrupt practices, it comes back to the point that I mentioned in my initial remark that if the rules are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, even though how much we want to comply, it is practically quite difficult and costly for the businesses to comply with all those rules. It's not just about foreign corruption practices, but the rules that regulate those practices. So we want to convey the message to each government actually to work together and come up with a kind of more unified rules on those regulations. And maybe OECD is the perfect forum for that. We've been working on that issue actually to make sure those rules are essential but still maybe feasible and practicable on the ground. And for that purpose, the policy alignment among countries is essential, not just OECD countries, but throughout the globe, actually.
Rick or John?
So I can only speak to the businesses that I work with, or I will only speak about the businesses that I work with. But I can tell you that democratic values are something that they think about really regularly. It's not amorphous. It's something that they talk about in the boardrooms. It's something that they talk about when they're looking to places to invest. It's what they talk about when they're looking at their home countries as well. I think they look for reciprocity. So I think that's incredibly important when it comes to making investment decisions in foreign countries, for example. But again, I don't see it as something that's completely static and specific to one country. Reciprocity is important, but it's not always practical.
Any thoughts?
I just on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I'm a recovering lawyer, and I found it rather remarkable that it was subjected to that executive order. I think that when I go overseas, I get asked that question a lot about what's the United States doing, and the unfortunate signal, of course, is decided we're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that aggressively. I think what was probably intended was to say, and this goes to the whole point of our meeting today, that corruption, unfortunately, is out there. And it's out there to a point where it's the corrupt are undermining the ability of American business, which tries to play by the rules. It's undermining our ability to be competitive. So I think there was a point trying to be made, and I note, by the way, that the Department of Justice issued some follow-on commentary and frequently asked questions regarding the enforcement of FCPA, and they sort of walked back a little bit. But I think in the context of the corporate community, in terms of how you conduct yourself, much to the point made earlier, you're always going to have to operate under the laws and the rules and the regulations of the jurisdiction you're operating in anyway. I can't think of any jurisdiction where CityWorks, we have a presence in over 100 countries, where it says it's okay to bribe. So we're going to go along with basically following the law and not obviously to undertake corrupt practices and obviously to deal. I think the biggest issue on corrupt practices, frankly, is your external contractors and how you monitor that. And the more you can monitor that effectively, the less you reduce your exposure to possible prosecutions.
Thank you. And we had a question over here.
Hi, I'm Malati Knight from Verity Research Sri Lanka, and thank you for a really, really interesting session. My question is more about the on-the-ground, practical nitty-gritties of getting this done. So we know all the elements, the variables that need to be in place to get to this ideal or even the second-best solution, right? Now, when you have to deal with challenges like crony capitalism, regulatory challenges, informational asymmetries, and where the rule of law is not robust, and where you have both market and government failures, and a breakdown in trust, obviously. How do you get to accountability in this situation? And real regulatory impact assessment, does that have a role in simplifying regulations, creating awareness, and what are some other workable solutions? For instance, what can we do in Sri Lanka, which has all of these variables? Thank you.
Rick, would you like to, I know with your...
I wasn't hearing it real well.
Okay, so you were asking where there's...
I have a thought on it.
Go ahead,
that's okay.
and also if I'll repeat a
Yeah.
little bit. I think what your question is that when you, are you trying to operate in a economic environment where sometimes the rules aren't as concrete and easy to follow, but you're trying your hardest to do that. And you have international relationships perhaps with other people in the room, so you fall in the boat of the person that's trying to maintain this and help everybody else with those compliance issues. Is that what you were asking? Okay, John.
I would say if you're operating in an environment where compliance issues or regulations are not as robust as they are in your home country, then look to your home country as a guide. If they have robust compliance and regulations. I mean, take the Anti-Bribery Act in the UK, for example. There's probably no country that Citibank operates in where bribery is legal. But the reality, of course, is even if it was legal in the country, you still wouldn't engage in bribery because you'd be subject to litigation or challenges in the UK. And that's not just in the UK. That's legislation that's replicated in many countries. So, I think living to the high standards is incredibly important if you're in government or business rather, and investing overseas.
Yeah, I think too one of the beauties, if you will, of multinational enterprises is that the corporate hierarchy requires everyone to abide by the same principles and operating procedures. And if you're a company like Citi or any one of the MNCs I can think of in the United States, for example, you're best in class when it comes to compliance, when it comes to dealing with questions of operating within that jurisdiction. A lot of times it's the gold standard by which you're going to operate. It's not necessarily what's permitted in that country. So and it goes sort of to some of the points we've been making here today, which is corporations they don't have to sit back and just wait for the government to tell them what to do. They have to establish their own principles, their own codes of conduct, their own mission statements, and then they have to obviously self-enforce. And that happens. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't work for many of the companies that we know of who no longer work there because they violated the mission statement, they violated the code of conduct, whatever. So there's a lot of self-enforcement that goes on. And that's where I think American business, when it's operating in some of these jurisdictions, really uplifts the standards by which other companies would like to try to operate themselves. And it's something that's so important in terms of U.S. commercial diplomacy, is to continue to operate that way.
And Neil, I know the Chamber has companies of all sizes, right? And so and I think probably one of the questions you're asking is for smaller companies that are servicing or trying to get into service large multinationals. How do you all, and we have within the United States many times have conversations about, well, yeah, a big company can follow those rules, but a small company doesn't have the resources in order to be entrepreneurial and effective. How do you deal with it in the Chamber, and what advice might you give?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the chief missions of the Chambers, right, to be an advocate for those small businesses who, as the ambassador described, can't comply, don't have scale. It's about creating kind of that level playing field. I think to your question, I think that in addition to the role of the Chamber, that's the role of business organizations in Sri Lanka and around the world. It's the role, I think, of SITE. I think it's the role of the international institutions that we've talked about. When U.S. trade policy is at its best, it's an objective of U.S. trade policy, right? To lift the corporate governance, operational, regulatory, predictable standards of those who we are trading most intimately with. And so I think it's kind of all of those things should be working together to try to lift those standards.
Yes. Usually, if there's room for interpretation and if the rules are too vague or the policy objective is not that clear, we would, if you have a lot of money, you can hire lawyers and help you interpret the situation, the law. But in other cases, Keidanren usually kind of collect good practices, how other companies are doing in that kind of situation, to help understand what would be the better way for each company to come up with a solution to meet with that compliance needs. So we may collect good practices from within the country, but sometimes we go to other countries and other foreign companies who are operating in other jurisdictions, but with a similar situation, so that we can kind of synthesize what's the better way for the businesses to comply in that kind of situation.
I have to say, it made me think that perhaps SIPE has a new activity on AI, so that someone sitting at this table could go, what do I do in this situation, and how do these other people handle it? So I know that's my default. Yes, this will be our last question, so we'll go right here. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations to all of you for this very interesting panel. I would like to make a question maybe for Mr. Johnston. It's about OECD. How can OECD can help governments in order to assume some of the good practices from the private sector? I am a former public servant in Colombia, and we were very focused in assuming the compliance system for the public sector, for the executive branch. And of course, we, as a member of OECD, we asked in OECD if there were some kind of experiences in other governments. It was not. Colombia was the first to do this. So we asked to some of the governments who are members of OECD. The South Korean government was so helpful for us. And this is something I would like to invite you to think, because private sector and government are different, of course, but both are institutions. And we all are, have to be committed to build stronger institutions. So stronger institutions in the public sector means a better economy, better rules of law, better possibilities for the business community, but it's also necessary to have this kind of a partnership, how the private sector can help public sector, because sometimes people want to do what it's correct to do. And so many companies has a lot of money to invest in compliance. Public sector doesn't have sometimes the same amount of money, don't have the same technology. So companies could be so committed in order to help to elevate the quality of governments and the quality of institutions, because this is the best business for all of us. And the Japanese government was so good also in terms of compliance. So thank you.
So Rick, you'll get to be the last answer.
Okay, real quick. I think, number one, I agree with everything you're saying about the need for that working relationship. And frankly, the government and the OECD were finding in the last several years that the OECD Secretariat, which obviously does a lot of the work, but takes on Business at OECD's recommendations and considers them, they've been actually much more receptive in the last couple of years to what the business community, the global business community, as I said, BIAC representing about 11 million different enterprises around the world in all the OECD countries. What we are suggesting is doable. BIAC itself, and I think perhaps a vehicle for you to think more about, and for those of you who are really interested in the OECD, which, by the way, is in my opinion, the international organization champion for free enterprise, democracy, the things that CIPE is all about. I can't think of another international organization that is more in tune with what we talk about here today, and is trying to push that into not just the OECD member states, but other aspiring countries to be into the OECD, which is a rather interesting exercise in and of itself. They call it the accession process. And countries like Brazil now want to become a member. You know, it's a little bit on hold with President Lula, but countries like Brazil do aspire to be part of the OECD. Indonesia is another example. So the OECD, for all of us in the business community who are trying to look at a place to focus our efforts to encourage greater corporate governance, less corruption, et cetera, the OECD is a great forum for that. And I'm going to be a bit biased in pushing BIAC as an organization representing the private sector in making these kinds of recommendations and communications with the OECD. I'll point out to you that, by the way, December 9th apparently is Anti-Corruption Day. And
write your LinkedIn post now.
Yeah, and BIAC is hosting an event in Berlin on that day. We have a Zero Corruption Forum, BIAC is calling it. We meet annually, and the next one will be in February 2026, so stay tuned. And we're also collaborating with the B20 on a business integrity as a driver of growth at the South African B20 that's coming up. So I think that you know, I'll finish by simply saying there is an opportunity for business partnership, working with government through these kinds of institutions that are really the true champions of a free market democratic system.
Well, thank you this really does conclude our session. I'm calling this part 2 of our session. And I would say what part 2 of our session did for us is it reinforced the importance of CIPE and the work you're doing today. Trust with the private sector, having an abundance of law and regulation makes it too difficult for people. So what can we do by following some of the work coming out of OECD, the work coming out of CIPE, the Chamber, Keidanren, the Business Council, and how do regulations function so that they can allow us to maintain what we've had since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is billions and trillions of dollars moving back and raising people out of poverty and giving people greater opportunity to participate in the free market that supports people's freedoms. So thank you for your time. Our group is going to take a picture, and then I believe there's a break. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me tell you, Lisa, this was wonderfully moderated, rich discussion that I really enjoyed, and I know there was a lot of enjoyment. That's my feedback right now. But please take a look at that little square. In addition to the panel title and the information about the panelists, that's a way for you to give us feedback on the entire conference today. So please take advantage of us and tell us how we can make this better. I know it's already great, but tell us how we can make it better. The the breaks right now, it ends 11:15. So please correct your agendas. We end at 11:15. We're back for the second panel. I just want to comment on Marta Lucia's question. She identified herself as a former public servant. That position is former vice president of Colombia. So just a little clarification there. She'll be on our next panel after the break. So please enjoy it. Please come take the pictures of the panelists. Thank you very much, all. Enjoy the coffee break.